That morning, the sun hadn't even broken above the rooftops when I opened the back door and felt a strange emptiness in my chest, as if something was out of place in my own backyard. The smell of disturbed earth came even before the full picture of the disaster, and for a moment I had the feeling of entering territory that no longer belonged to me. My garden, that space I cared for so lovingly, where I planted as if placing a part of my soul in the earth, seemed to have been run over by a storm that only fell there, in that single piece of my world. The flowers were uprooted, the seedlings turned over, some plants literally ripped out by the roots and left aside as if they had no value whatsoever. It was like looking at a mutilated body. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been an animal. There was intent there, and that intent hit me like a punch. I stood there for long seconds, unable to move a muscle. The pain wasn't just from seeing something broken, it was the pain of realizing that someone, of their own volition, had chosen to destroy something I had built with patience, care, and a kind of silent love. The feeling of invasion was so strong that I felt exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't just a garden. It was my refuge, my peaceful corner, my natural therapy after tiring days. That place gave me balance, and seeing it all like that made me feel like someone had crossed all boundaries, ignored all limits, and written a clear message right there on the ground. I can step onto your space whenever I want. My heart was pounding, but not with fear, with frustration, with indignation, with a kind of anger that doesn't burn on the outside but corrodes from within. I began to walk slowly among the rubble, kneeling here and there to try to salvage what I could. I touched the crumbling earth, felt the root of one of my oldest plants completely broken. My hands trembled, not from physical exhaustion, but from helplessness. Each plant there had a story, a reason, a memory. Some had been gifts, others had been cultivated from tiny seeds. Seeing everything destroyed like that was like losing an entire archive of memories that I could never recover in the same way. As I watched, something even more disturbing formed in my mind. The most obvious alternative. This destruction hadn't happened on its own. It hadn't been the work of the wind, the rain, or an animal. And when I looked up and observed the fence on the right, the fence that separated me from my neighbor's house, I felt my stomach sink. It was impossible not to connect the dots. I had already noticed sideways glances, heard biting comments about people who don't know how to use their yard, and noticed a certain discomfort from him regarding the care I devoted to my garden. But I never thought that someone would be capable of crossing the line, literally, and putting their hands where they shouldn't. At that moment, it was as if an invisible curtain opened inside me. A mixture of sadness, anger, and curiosity began to bubble up. Who would do this? Why? What could motivate a person to destroy something like that without any benefit, without need, just out of malice or for a strange pleasure in causing discomfort? And most importantly, what would I do with this information, with this pain, with this feeling that my own home had been violated? I took a deep breath, trying to make sense of my thoughts, but the harder I tried, the more confused I became. I stood up slowly and took a few steps back, trying to look at the destroyed garden as a whole, as if that way I could find some logic in the chaos. But there was no logic. There was no acceptable explanation, just pure, harsh, intentional destruction. At that point, one thing became crystal clear. This wouldn't be the last time. Something inside me, instinct perhaps, whispered that this was only the beginning. The way the plants had been uprooted, the way the earth had been disturbed, it didn't seem like a momentary outburst. It had method. It had repetition. He bore the mark of someone who would return if he weren't arrested. And then, at that exact moment, as I tried to gather the strength to begin cleaning up the mess, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Because the truth, even though I didn't want to admit it yet, was that I was about to live through days that would test my temperament, my patience, and my sanity. I still had no idea what was coming, and even less of an idea of how, in less than 48 hours, I would make the person responsible beg for mercy. It was there, amidst that scene of destruction, that the first spark of silent revenge was born within me. Not an impulsive, noisy, or violent revenge, but a revenge built with intelligence, patience, and precision. A revenge that no one would see coming. A revenge that would transform that neighbor into someone completely different when it was over. And it all started with that thought echoing in my mind. But I had no idea that this would happen every day, and that my silent revenge would make that neighbor beg for mercy in less than 48 hours. In the days following the first destruction of my garden, I tried to convince myself that perhaps I was exaggerating. Maybe it had been an animal, maybe the wind, maybe some unfortunate coincidence. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. I would have preferred a natural accident 1,000 times over the idea that a human being, and worse, someone who lived a few meters from me, could have done it deliberately. But the truth rarely bends to our wishes. And as the mornings progressed, the signs began to appear like pieces of a puzzle that someone, cruelly, was assembling before my eyes. On Monday, I found footprints in the ground, human footprints, clear, deep marks that ran right across the flower bed where I had replanted some of the flowers that survived the first damage. They seemed to have been left on purpose, like an arrogant signature, as if the intruder wanted me to know that he could enter whenever he wanted. The feeling that gripped my chest was pure indignation. It was no longer just disrespect, it was provocation. On Tuesday, I noticed something even worse. Some of my tools had been tampered with. The shovel I always kept leaning against the wall was in the middle of the yard, dirty, as if someone had used it for digging. The pruning shears, which were normally kept in the shed, were lying near the fence, open, with the blade bent. It didn't make sense. No one was allowed to go in there. No friends had visited, and I would never leave my tools like that. I felt the blood rush to my face, and a deep unease gripped my stomach. It was the silent confirmation that something more sinister was happening. But the turning point came Wednesday morning. I opened the door as usual, my heart already heavy, expecting to find some damage, but what I saw left me completely speechless. One of my oldest shrubs, one I had been growing for over 3 years, had been uprooted, exactly in the same spot where I had replanted the destroyed seedlings days before. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. It was personal. Someone was going after the plants that meant the most to me, as if they wanted to hurt me emotionally, as if they took pleasure in seeing my things destroyed again and again. From that moment on, it finally hit me hard. It wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. No matter how hard I tried to fool myself, no one trips over the same flower bed 3 times. No one dismantles a garden with such precision by mistake. There was intention, calculation, repetition, and all of it was directed at me. The feeling that overwhelmed me was a mixture of powerlessness and injustice so great that for a few minutes I sat in the middle of the yard, staring at the exposed roots of the shrub, unable to process anything. It was as if someone had invaded not only my physical space, but also my emotional one, tearing my tranquility out by the roots. The garden, which had always been my place of peace, was now a battlefield where I woke up every day expecting the next attack. And as if that weren't enough, something even more disturbing began to happen. I noticed that my neighbor, the one from next door, the same one who always watched everything with an air of forced disinterest, would always appear out of nowhere when I went out to the yard. He would pretend to be doing something, watering the plants, tidying up tools, walking around with a distracted air. But there was always that strange smile, that narrow smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that seemed more like mockery than sympathy. And although I had no proof at that moment, a shiver would always run down my spine when our eyes met. It was as if he knew something I didn't, as if he was enjoying the situation, as if he were waiting for my reaction, and even worse, as if he were preparing his next move. And then that detail began to haunt me. He always smiled when I left the house, but there was something in his eyes that deeply bothered me. That look wasn't one of courtesy. It wasn't the friendly, neighborly gaze. It was a look filled with something I couldn't define at the time. Provocation, perhaps? Superiority? A strange mixture of pleasure and challenge? It seemed like the look of someone watching a domino about to fall, knowing that he himself had pushed the first one. As the days went by, I began to notice more and more signs that I had previously ignored. The fence, for example, had small marks, as if someone had placed their foot or hand on it to climb up. One of the planks was slightly displaced, as if it had been forced from the other side. And one afternoon, when I decided to check the shed where I kept my tools, I found footprints in the dust, footprints that weren't mine. All of this created within me a growing sense of anger, a frustration that turned into indignation each time I remembered my destroyed garden. And, at the same time, a suffocating mystery grew. Why would someone do that? What did they gain from it? Why mess with something so personal to me? I tried to find answers, but the more I thought, the more the pieces seemed to form a larger picture, a picture that pointed ever more clearly to the neighbor with the strange smile. And the more I realized this, the clearer it became that I was dealing with someone who wasn't going to stop anytime soon, someone who was testing my limits, watching my patience wear thin, perhaps expecting an explosive reaction. But he wouldn't get it. He wasn't dealing with someone impulsive, and little did he know, the more he tried to affect me, the more I began to plan. It was at that moment that I realized that escalation wasn't just destruction. It was a silent invitation to a war he thought he could control. But he was profoundly mistaken. And there, standing before my garden ruined for the third time, I understood that the battle was only beginning. After the third consecutive destruction, something changed inside me. Until then, I had only reacted with frustration, sadness, and indignation. I cleaned up the mess, replanted what I could, and tried to move on, as if it were simply a bad phase, an unfortunate sequence of coincidences. But there, kneeling amidst the uprooted roots, with soil clinging to my hands and heavy breathing, I realized that continuing to react the same way would only put me back in the cycle he seemed to want. With each new day, I was the victim, and he, the invisible aggressor who controlled the rhythm of my days with calculated attacks. It was on that silent morning that the key turned. Slowly, as if making a difficult decision, I raised my gaze, wiped the dirt from my hands, and felt a different kind of determination rising within me. It wasn't explosive anger. It wasn't a desire for direct confrontation. It was something much deeper, colder, more strategic. A phrase resonated in my head with almost frightening clarity. I stopped complaining. I started planning. And at that moment, I knew that if he wanted war, I would give it. But in my own way, silently. It wouldn't be by yelling at the fence. It wouldn't be by banging on his door. It wouldn't be by creating neighborhood feuds. I wouldn't stoop to his level. On the contrary, I would use intelligence, the law, and precision to turn the tables. And when I was done, he wouldn't just regret it. He would beg for mercy. The first steps were internal. Before taking any concrete action, I spent days observing, analyzing patterns, paying attention to schedules, noises, and movements. With each detail I noticed, it became clearer that my neighbor wasn't just impulsive, he was methodical. He always acted in the early morning hours, when the streets were empty, and when he knew I was still sleeping. He studied my behavior. It was almost as if he had turned my garden into a game board, and that's exactly what gave me a huge advantage. I could also observe, and unlike him, I could plan calmly, patiently, and intelligently, without rushing, without mistakes. I started with what many ignore, to her. I spent an entire afternoon researching municipal regulations regarding trespassing, property damage, and environmental crimes. Because yes, destroying plants can, in certain contexts, be considered an environmental crime, especially if it involves specific species or repeated damage. I discovered articles, regulations, and even court decisions involving cases very similar to mine. The law was on my side, and he clearly had no idea. At that moment, I began to feel a kind of cold relief. There was no need for shouting. There would be documentation. There would be no violence. There would be evidence. But evidence, to have value, needs to be recorded. And that's when I made the second strategic decision, to install cameras. Not those obvious huge cameras that anyone can spot from afar. I needed something discreet, capable of capturing movement in the backyard without drawing attention. I researched models, evaluated angles, studied where the natural light hit at dawn, where the shadows were densest. I planned everything as if I were setting up a scene to capture a rare image, as if I were preparing a luminous, silent, and unavoidable trap. I bought 2 compact, waterproof cameras with night vision and built-in batteries, perfect for hiding among the plants. I installed one near the fence, pointed at the area where I knew he usually went. The other was further away, capturing the entire yard as a wide shot. After carefully positioning them, almost like planting something valuable, I observed the strange feeling that, for the first time, I had some control over the situation. It was as if I had turned on a light in a room where someone was used to acting in the dark, but the plan didn't stop there. I knew he could change course, change strategy when he realized something was different. So I decided to use the garden itself as part of my plan. I researched plant species that left specific marks when touched, leaves that broke easily and displayed clearly identifiable ruptures. I studied footprint patterns in the soil types that better register body weight, and even ways to arrange the flower bed so that any improper intervention would alter the symmetry I knew by heart. With each detail I added to the plan, I felt something curious happening inside me. The feeling of powerlessness diminished. Fear transformed into clarity. Frustration became focus. It was as if I was gradually regaining control over my own space. It wasn't just about catching the culprit. It was about reclaiming my peace, my garden, my territory. But I knew I couldn't reveal everything at once. The complete plan was more complex than it seemed, involving layers I still needed to adjust. So, as I walked through the yard every day pretending to just replant, tidying the soil, and putting in new seedlings, I was actually rearranging pieces. With each step, I was preparing the ground for what was to come. And all this while, the neighbor continued to smile in that strange way whenever he saw me. A thin, almost imperceptible smile, but laden with something that wasn't kindness. He watched me, as if he thought he was in control, as if he believed the other person was defenseless. But he had no idea what was about to happen. He didn't know that I wasn't reacting anymore. I was anticipating every move. At that point, the game had completely changed. It was no longer about a destroyed garden. It was about strategy, vigilance, intelligence, and patience. I was building a silent network of evidence, preparing for the exact moment when his mask would fall before he had time to react. And as I walked through the yard, with the earth still fresh in my hands and the feeling that the plan was finally taking shape, I repeated to myself, if he wanted war, I would give it to him, but my way, silently. The day he would unmask him was much closer than he imagined, and far more devastating than he could have predicted. The moment arrived when everything I had planned began to fall into place like the pieces of an old clock, precise, inevitable, and relentless in its cadence. The cameras I had installed began collecting images at the times I had predicted. The test plants recorded any contact. The organization of my garden clearly showed when someone walked where they shouldn't. But most importantly, I wanted to transform these small clues, footprints, marks, movements, into irrefutable proof. I didn't just want to embarrass my neighbor. I wanted the consequence to have the weight of the law, of public shame, and of acknowledging the damage. I wanted justice, not blind vengeance. In the early hours of the first decisive day, I reviewed every recording from the previous night. The nighttime footage was grainy, but sufficient. A familiar silhouette, the measured walk, the way he leaned his body as he crossed the fence. There were specific movements, the way he placed his hand on the fence, the way he stepped onto the flower bed with his right foot first, that sent chills down my spine. It was him. There was no longer any doubt. I noted times, minutes, patterns. I took screenshots, cropped the relevant sections, and generated files with dates and timestamps. I transformed that into technical evidence because nothing is as infuriating as someone who destroys your space and still thinks they'll get away with it. Meanwhile, I organized everything into a dossier. Photos of the shattered plants with captions. Images of the footprints compared to those I had in the storage room, where coincidentally a similar shoe had been found, excerpts from the recordings with timestamps, and a short report explaining the repeated damage and the estimated loss. Overlaying all of this, I included research I had done on legislation, showing where his conduct could be classified: damage to property, disturbance of the peace, and, depending on the species affected, characterization as environmental damage. I didn't want to be just an emotional victim. I wanted to be an organized, irrefutable complainant. With the dossier ready, I moved on to the second stage, the intelligent complaint. Instead of going straight to the police station and filing a police report with emotions running high, which could be interpreted as an exaggeration, I scheduled a visit to the Municipal Environmental Agency. I explained the situation, presented the photos and recordings, and asked for formal guidance on how to proceed. They were attentive. I provided the dossier and requested a technical inspection, highlighting the repeated damage and the potential risk to the planted species. The service was efficient. A technician noted everything, scheduled an inspection date, and advised me to immediately go to the police station with the document that would carry the most weight. Meanwhile, I took the opportunity to increase the pressure in a way he never expected. I used his behavior against him. I started discreetly talking to neighbors, asking for reports, times when they saw him loitering in the area, if they had noticed anything strange. The response was timid, but enough to confirm that it wasn't just my paranoia. Some people timidly said they had noticed the man walking more than usual at night, fiddling with things in his yard with a flashlight, or going back and forth with bags. That didn't seem to be garbage bags. I wrote down each report asking them to notify the police if they witnessed anything. All of this was pieced together as indirect but valuable evidence. The next day, the scheduled time for the Environmental Agency's technical inspection. They arrived with a uniformed professional and a small notepad. Their presence changed the scenario. Having them in my backyard, examining the soil, assessing the species, and recording repeated damage, transformed my complaint as an offended neighbor into an official matter, something that could have administrative and even criminal repercussions. As the technician walked through the flower bed and pointed out the same marks I recognized, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The legal mechanism was in motion. At the same time, I had already filed a police report at the station, attaching the dossier and requesting an investigation. I explained everything calmly, showing evidence, dates, witnesses, and the inspection scheduled by the Environmental Agency. The police chief analyzed it carefully. There was a basis for investigation. As soon as the police station made the formal report, an investigator explained to me that the next natural step would be to seek out the neighbor himself for clarification and, if the evidence was sufficient, bring him to the station for questioning. And that's where the final race began. The next 48 hours would be decisive. From that moment on, my strategy ceased to be merely tactical and took on an immense psychological element. He knew that being approached by authorities is disconcerting. You know that someone who acts in the dark doesn't usually know how to handle the light. So, in parallel with the official actions, I started doing something to contain the social pressure. I discreetly spread general information among the residents of the street about vandalism of gardens and the importance of preserving green spaces. I didn't make public accusations. I simply touched the nerves of the community so that if they saw something suspicious, they would report it to the authorities. The idea was simple: to create an environment where his discovery would not only be legal, but also socially embarrassing. And the effect was immediate. On the afternoon of the inspection, the agency technician took photographs and completed a preliminary report linking the incidents to intentional damage and recommending action. It was enough material for the police station to request explanations from the neighbor. Shortly before sunset, 2 municipal police officers knocked on his door. While I waited outside, hidden and observing through the crack in my curtain, I felt my heart race. There was something theatrical about that moment. Justice approaching, slow but steady. And then the scene I had imagined so many times unfolded. A scene that also filled me with a strange mixture of victory and compassion. The doorbell rang. I heard footsteps inside the house. The door opened. Two officers appeared, their faces serious. The smile he usually displayed so nonchalantly simply vanished. His expression changed in fractions of a second. Surprise, confusion, fear. When the officers began to explain that there were formal complaints, a technical inspection, and images showing him at the scene, his face collapsed. He tried to deny it, stammered, looked around for support. There was no way out. At the police station, faced with the evidence, the videos, the photos, the testimonies, and the preliminary report, he couldn't maintain his composure. Pride gave way to despair. His defenses withered like forgotten leaves in the sun. Tears welled up. His voice trembled, and with a sincerity that sounded both disconcerting and humiliating, he confessed. He apologized. He begged for mercy. That man who had once smiled disdainfully now pleaded breathlessly for a second chance. I listened to him. I didn't feel cruel satisfaction. I felt relief at the revealed truth and the possibility that, with the confession, I could finally rebuild without fear. When there was a knock on his door, the smile simply vanished. In the end, the formal punishment ran its course. Warnings, detailed statements, an agreement to repair the damage, and monitoring of conduct. But the most profound consequence was something else. The man knew, publicly and indisputably, that his actions had consequences, not only legal, but moral. And I, finally, could walk through my garden without feeling the tightness in my chest that I had felt before. The revenge I planned wasn't noisy. It was precise. It was legal. It was uncomfortable for him in the exact measure of the harm he caused. And most importantly, in less than 48 hours, the silent justice I orchestrated made him apologize. And that was the moment I realized that the peace I sought didn't come from an impulsive reaction, but from a calculated, well-founded, and above all, just action. The silence after the storm always seems longer than usual. When everything finally calmed down, when the footsteps of the authorities moved away from my neighbor's door and the tension that hung in the air began to dissolve, I realized something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. A deep, almost physical peace, as if an immense weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But before reaching that moment, there was still one last chapter in this story. A chapter that didn't involve shouting, irrational revenge, or direct confrontations. Just the inevitable consequences of choices that weren't made by me. In the days following my neighbor's plea for mercy, his behavior changed completely. The man who used to walk around his yard with that crooked smile of someone who knows he's doing something wrong but believes no one will ever find out, simply disappeared. He avoided looking at me, avoided walking near the fence, even avoided leaving the house at the times I used to be in my garden. And ironically, it was in that uncomfortable silence that I realized the true victory wasn't in seeing him shrink away, but in recovering something he had taken from me without permission, the feeling of security within my own space. So I decided to focus my energy on what really mattered. I spent hours replanting seedlings, putting the ornamental fences back in place, rebuilding the small stone path he had destroyed so many times. Each gesture seemed like a ritual of reconstruction, not just of the land, but of myself. The garden, which had once been a jumble of broken roots and torn petals, began to come back to life, and it was almost poetic to think that while the plants were reborn stronger than before, I was also being reborn along with them. There was a special moment, a few days later, that definitively marked the end of that cycle. I was kneeling near the small lavender patch, the same lavender he had destroyed with almost daily glee, and I noticed that new shoots had emerged, small, fragile, but persistent. It was a silent reminder that not everything that is hurt ceases to bloom. Sometimes, the damage is just the beginning of a new chapter. As I stood up, covered in dirt and sweat, I noticed something that made me smile in a way I hadn't smiled in a long time. On the other side of the fence, the neighbor watched the garden as if looking into a mirror that finally reveals its true image, someone who tried to destroy it, but ended up destroying himself in the process. He lowered his head, as if carrying a weight that cannot be shared, and went back inside. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt understanding, not empathy, because some actions don't deserve excuses, but the understanding that certain people only learn when the consequences hit them harder than any words could. It was at that moment that the final lesson of the story became clear to me. I never needed to raise my voice. I never needed to retaliate with the same violence. I simply let the consequences speak for themselves, and they spoke loudly, louder than any neighborly argument, louder than any backyard fight, louder than any destruction he may have caused. Silence, sometimes, is the most powerful weapon there is. With the garden restored, I realized that that space represented something greater than plants and flowers. It represented boundaries. It represented respect. It represented the right to exist in peace without someone trying to destroy it just because they could. Ultimately, it represented the silent justice that life always delivers, sooner or later, to those who insist on crossing boundaries that were not meant to be crossed. Today, when I walk through my yard, I feel something different. I no longer look to the side expecting the next attack. My heart doesn't clench when I see a broken branch. I don't wonder if tomorrow will bring more sabotage. What I see now is color, life, fragrance, rebirth. What I feel now is peace, a peace so great that it's beautiful to witness. And perhaps ironically, I realized that the true outcome of this story wasn't the neighbor's downfall, but my own rise. I recovered my garden. I recovered my peace. I recovered my space. And above all, I recovered the certainty that when someone tries to destroy what we love, we don't need to act with fury, only with intelligence, patience, and firmness. Because in the end, my garden bloomed again. Me too. If this story has captivated you this far, leave a like and comment. What would your reaction be if someone destroyed your garden? Your opinion could appear in the next video.